Okay, well, good morning, everyone. So it's an honor to open this session. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I guess, like me, most of you jumped at the chance to come to Amsterdam in the spring. So how many of you have a PhD? Okay, nearly everybody. So if you try and think back, so for some of us that's a little while, maybe you can remember during probably the first year of your PhD, that dawning realization that not everything you were reading in the journals was true. In fact, you probably can all name papers that you know are wrong and that are so wrong that really they shouldn't have been published. And here I'm talking about wrong, not just in the sense of a lack of integrity, somebody's been cheating, but a much broader sense where there's something about the design, the interpretation, the analysis, statistics, but also maybe fraud, that means that you can't rely on the paper. And there are going to be lots of speeches in the coming days diagnosing the various problems that can cause a paper to be wrong. And in fact, we had a little insight in the play yesterday. I thought it was brilliant. That kind of thing can be pretty cheesy, but I thought they did a really good job, actually. Okay, so I'll just shout out to John Ioannidis and Brian Nosek, who will certainly be talking about the causes of problems in science today. So what did you do about the paper that you didn't like? So probably you criticized it in a journal club. The UK version is you complained to friends in the pub. If your pay grade is a little high, you probably complained to colleagues at a conference. But all of these actions have in common that they're pretty ineffective, inefficient, and they're ephemeral. So does it matter, you might say to me, science is supposed to be self-correcting, but that does beg the question, how optimal is that self-correction? Does it happen quickly, or does it occur on a geological timescale? So has anybody ever tried to correct a publication in the literature? Okay, a few people. Was that an easy experience? So I think generally it's not an easy experience. Have you ever played snakes and ladders? So let's play the correction game together. So journals don't like correcting papers. So what they want is original research. So even if you're correcting a paper, you're going to have to do some, do some experiments, do some original work. And even if so that's a test tube. You can see that we're scientists at Pub here, not artists. So even if the original paper was accepted with some fairly lightweight statistics, certainly your correction won't be. You'll have to do a lot of work. You'll need somebody to do it. You might need some money to do it. Where are you going to get the money? Well, you're going to apply for a grant, and you're going to say in the grant proposal, I want to do exactly the same thing as somebody has already done. Okay, you might struggle to get it funded. So I don't know what funding is like where you come from, but where I come from, everything has to be revolutionary, groundbreaking, and doing what somebody else has already done is not groundbreaking. What about the group that you are potentially going to criticize? They might have some key reagents, that knockout mouse. Are they going to share it with you? Of course they should, but maybe there'll be an unfortunate accident with the breeding colony before they can send it to you. So those same people will be making important decisions about your career, potentially. A lot of these decisions are made anonymously, so grants, acceptance of papers in good journals, of course, promotions, jobs, and you'll be taking a serious risk with your career if you antagonize anybody, in fact. Okay, so let's imagine you get as far as the high-impact journal that originally published the research, and although when they thought the story might be true, it was fantastically interesting, now that you've shown it's wrong, suddenly it's not interesting at all. Okay, so it falls below that impact threshold. So why don't you send it to a more specialist journal? Okay, of course, the specialist journal has absolutely no interest at all in clearing up the mess of the glamour journal. Okay, so you're somewhat stuck there. And basically, the whole thing can take a lot of time. And in fact, you might notice that I haven't described, the button doesn't work too well, many ladders in this game, mostly snakes. So in today's high-pressure environment, no pragmatic researcher is going to take the risk of trying to correct work that is in the literature. There's strong incentives just to accept what's in the literature and to root around it. No idiot would only idiots would try to correct the literature. If we analyze the situation a little bit, we realize that all of the actors that are supposed to be ensuring the integrity, reliability, the correction of science are subject to quite strong subjects of conflicts of interest. So the authors, journals and their editors, institutions. So obviously some people try to manage those conflicts of interest, but they do exist, and we think they do play an important role. One is often reminded of the great quote by Upton Sinclair about the difficulty of convincing somebody when his salary is on the line. Okay, so maybe we can bypass those conflicts of interest using the revolutionary new technology called the internet. So how about when you see a problem in a paper, you could put that information on the internet and all interested researchers could read about it immediately and make their own decision. So researcher to researcher without intermediaries. And that's the idea behind PubPeer. So this site launched in 2012. The founders were Brandon Stell, George Smith, the developer, and Richard Smith. And these days it's a non-profit foundation. So every article that's published today comes with an identifier, usually a digital object identifier, a DOI, and that allows the site to create a page containing information about the paper, the title, the author list, and a comment box. And you can type a comment, press return, and maybe with a small delay for moderation, it will be available in this centralized platform to anybody in the world permanently. And the idea is that simple. You can comment on any paper you want. So that's intellectually satisfying. We have a way of discussing, correcting science. But as we operated the site, we came to realize that that sharing of information was really a bit more important than just scratching our own itch, as it were. So the research we do today builds on the scientific record. And if you base a project today, if you put a PhD student on a project, somebody's just published something exciting, but that research is not true or is unreliable, you'll be wasting their time. In today's environment, probably you've already finished their research career. You'll be wasting the money you raised, so taxpayers' money. Bad research leads to waste of private investments as well. The drug companies apparently are very upset about the state of preclinical research that they're trying to develop. And clinical trials are based on this kind of data as well sometimes. So those would be unethical if the research itself was not reliable. It goes beyond that. Research is the basis for any evidence-based public policy. So I know that seems to be in retreat at the moment, but nevertheless, any number of government policies are supposed to be based on evidence, on research. So agriculture, pollution, climate change, of course, GMOs, economic, social, and educational policy can also be based on research, even randomized trials sometimes. And even more important, maybe, medical guidelines. So we've already been given the example of Andrew Wakefield as an example of falsified medical research that caused preventable deaths. So he erroneously claimed that there was a link between vaccination and autism, and that caused many people to withhold their children from vaccination programs, leading to the measles epidemics that we now see. And measles kills a small proportion of people, but it kills. Here in the Netherlands, there was quite a high-profile case involving Don Poldermans, a cardiologist, who ran, or appeared to have run, a series of large clinical trials that provided evidence for a benefit of beta blockers given before, during, after operations. And he also, I believe, was chair of committees that produced Europe-wide guidelines in favor of this prophylactic use of beta blockers. But it turned out that those trials were unreliable based on non-existent data, it appears. He was fired. And reanalysis of the remaining data suggests that all of the people who were subjected to this treatment were exposed to an increased risk of mortality. So probably there were many preventable deaths because of that unreliable research. So when you're faced with those kind of issues, you begin to realize that if there's any problem with the scientific record, you need to make the readers, the users, the policymakers, the people making medical guidelines, you need to make them aware of the potential problems as quickly as possible. So it could save researcher careers, taxpayers' money, and it's maybe not a stretch to say that it could also save lives. So at PubPeer, the priority, our number one duty, is to alert readers and users of papers to potential problems. That's what our main aim is. And I should point out something that is often forgotten, is that this is a time-critical mission. So you need to know as soon as possible. And there is a tension, an incompatibility with how we normally run fraud investigations usually, which is top secrecy for 3, 4, 5 years until some conclusion maybe is reached. We think the readers should know that there's a problem. It's a bit like the principle of expressions of concern. I think they should be used much more often. Okay, so we want to encourage commenting because we think it's important. And PubPeer has one feature, one specificity that distinguishes it from other similar schemes that we believe greatly encourages in commenting, and that is that we allow full anonymity for the users. So in the example I gave, you may have noticed that the original comment was from somebody labeled, it was an unregistered submission. So initially, the website allowed people to log in and to comment under a pseudonym, but the site still knew who they were. And apparently that still prevented some people, people still didn't have the confidence to comment under those conditions. So after the early months, we allowed people to comment completely anonymously, and these were the unregistered submissions. And as this graph shows, commenting took off, so maybe I'll point that out. So here we have the comment volume for the first months of PubPeer, and as soon as we enabled user-controlled anonymity, the comment volume shot off. So you can see a few spikes of commenting volume related to some of the bigger scandals that came across our pages. So we now have a high volume of comments. Our database contains 70,000 user comments, about papers in over 2,000 journals. And from having read most of them, the registered, the logged in comments are really of no different quality to those made by people completely anonymously. A further argument for this encouragement provided by protection, provided by anonymity, is the light blue curve down here, and that's the volume of comments on PubMed Commons, who have a similar commenting scheme. But as you can see, the volume of their comments, commenting is much lower than on PubPeer, and we believe that's because of the fact that they don't allow anonymity, and despite the infinitely greater traffic that goes to PubMed compared to PubPeer. Okay, I'll just mention that if you really care about your anonymity when you're commenting, you can even use the Tor browser bundle. So it may not be NSA proof, but it will certainly protect you against the site being involved in a court case, or the site being hacked, or some screw-up of administration of the site. So if you run a website, this is like the law of gravity or death and taxes. This kind of accident is bound to happen at some point. There's already been one court case that we were able to defend successfully, but if you need the anonymity, use it. Okay, so anonymous commenting on the internet. What could possibly go wrong? So probably most of you thinking it's a recipe for libel, denigration, slander, and of course that is a possibility, but we have many layered safeguards that more or less prevent that from happening. So the main rule is that comments, so we're scientists, right? So comments have to be based on publicly verifiable information. So the key principle is that another reader should be able to judge for themselves if the comment is valid, to arrive at the same conclusion or to disagree with the conclusion. So we don't allow hearsay, but you're allowed to discuss the data in the paper, the relation to another paper, something in the news maybe if you like. There needs to be a public source of information, or you can have an argument based on logic or reasoning. Unregistered comments are moderated, so those are the totally anonymous comments. They're moderated to check that they comply with this guideline before they appear. Note that this is not a scientific review. It's just a factual comment. There are facilities for reporting abuse. You see the button on every comment. If you see a problem on the site, don't hesitate to report it. We look at those reports with care. Authors have a permanent right of reply. They're encouraged to engage, to defend and explain their work, and they receive alerts by email when their papers are commented. It's worth pointing out that the great majority of issues raised on PubPeer would be completely resolved by authors showing their original data. So most, for one reason or another, choose not to do that, but nevertheless that would resolve the issues, and in a way you can see the current situation as a transitional state because full data access is coming. A lot of journals already require it, so a lot of the issues that now cause disputes on PubPeer will be resolved upstream. People will just go straight to the data and sort it out for themselves. There's also community surveillance. So if somebody posts an unjustified comment, and it does happen sometimes, then other members of the community who read those comments do jump in and say, that's a load of rubbish. And finally, something that also we tend to forget, publication is a making public of work. It's a choice that the authors entered into willingly. And I don't want to be too unpleasant about it, but if you don't want your work discussed, maybe you should consider not publishing it. Okay, so full anonymity on PubPeer actually, somewhat to our surprise, enabled a class of comments highlighting of types of problem that we didn't really suspect existed and had more or less been suppressed by the current system up till now. So we'll show a few examples. How many of you have some experience in biomedical research? Okay, so that's quite a few of you. So most of these problems are just from potential image manipulation in biomedical research. And the problem, so generally biology is quite a variable, random process. So a lot of even the data images that are produced, they're unique because of that randomness. So what people began to notice is that there are figures that actually just had a lot of striking similarities where they wouldn't really be expected. So what happens is that the user will spot something like that, post a picture on PubPeer, and generally add some colored annotation to guide the eye. So, for instance, this is one of my favorites, where the 4 gel slices actually appear to be completely identical. So maybe it was a mistake, but none of the authors have shown up so far to show the original data and clear that up. And maybe it wasn't a mistake, in which case it's really quite interesting to speculate on the state of mind of the researcher who did this. It was that normal, and one could act with such impunity. It's also worth pointing out that there's reputation is no guarantee here. So you can see this kind of thing coming from the top researchers in the top universities, published in the top journals. So here's a particularly prolific researcher, and sometimes one wonders why. Someone who managed to raise 20 million in grants. And that actually raises an interesting question. If people are prepared to do this in published work, I bet they're prepared to do it in grant applications, and nobody is checking those. Nobody has any way of checking those. And we all know how important some exciting preliminary data is in obtaining a grant. So I think there's a bit of a black hole at the moment in grant applications that somebody will have to deal with one day. So the US are in the act as well. So these are 2 sets of cells in culture exposed to different conditions. So they would really have to be different cells. But a user helpfully drew those colored shapes to indicate cells that really have rather similar shapes, even if their distribution in space has changed a bit, and some of their nuclei have changed color. So any of you who have used antibodies have probably realized that sometimes they're not very specific. It can be tricky to find the conditions to make them work as claimed. So you will scour prior publications that appear to make them work. And also the vendor catalog sometimes has some validation. And somebody who clearly checked these two sources realized that publication appeared to be a composite of some of the vendor catalog validation gels. So there's a question of here who came first, but the vendor vehemently denies that they composed the gel, so maybe it was the researcher. Okay, so I've zoomed through that. I don't know how I'm doing for time, actually. 5 minutes, perfect. So this is actually pretty much my last slide. So where do we stand at the moment? So we would say that, so PubPeer exists, it's working, there are many people using it, and we would position it as a source of potentially critical information about articles in all research fields. So it's not just biomedical research. Most of the comments do concern biomedical research, but chemists, nanotechnologists, mathematicians sometimes, social sciences, management science. There are many smaller communities that also make use of the site. And the great advantage of post-publication peer review, the site is one source of post-publication peer review, is that you can, in the best of cases, get the considered opinion of multiple world experts who've really had time to digest, reflect on an article, giving you their opinion. So, of course, not all comments are such high quality, and we do insist that all readers must read for themselves the comments and decide if they're useful or not. Nevertheless, that's not a particularly onerous task. There's only a small volume of comments. They're extremely targeted. Either it's a problem or it's not. It can be a question of a few sentences sometimes to read, but it could highlight the problem that makes a difference to your research career. And to help you further, I'll present in a second browser plugins that help you identify articles that have been commented. And more generally, PubPeer and sites like it are fora for a community evaluation by researchers for researchers, cutting out all the intermediaries. So that evaluation is content-based. It's about what is in the paper, and with data access coming about what is in the data. It's completely independent of journal, metrics, reputation, institution, and we think that's a good thing. That's where we want to go. It's all about the substance. It's preprint friendly. There's nothing, it's perfectly possible to comment on preprints before they're ever published. Do we need publishing? That's a question for another day. And it's also a place where a mechanism to encourage and maybe to develop best practice. So I suspect there are a few of you, us, who've learned something about presenting, analyzing Western blot data from looking at PubPeer. Certainly that was the case for me. Okay, so here are the plugins. They do nothing, so they're available for Firefox, Chrome, and Safari. When you install them, they do nothing unless they recognize an article ID, a DOI, where the article has been commented on PubPeer. And then you get a little orange alert inserted in the web page to alert you to the fact that there's been discussion about the paper, and you can go and check it out. So you can continue working, browsing journal websites as here, or PubMed, and if there's something you should know about, you'll be alerted. So you should all install the plugin. And I'm going to be able to wrap up there. So after the questions, if you want to continue the discussion, I'll be available at a Meet the Experts session at 12:45. And for some further reading about the more controversial issues that I raised, you're welcome to check out some of our blog posts that you'll find on the website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Boris. So if people have questions, please line up.
Hi, I'm Robert Bachwitz, Emeritus Research in USA. And we, in part, do some consultation and try to help whistleblowers, primarily about medical research, but other areas as well. And several of those have expressed interest and attempted to use PubPeer in the past. I'm trying to find out what your current policies are. And we have heard that there were prohibitions against any implications of research misconduct. So for example, if they come with evidence that there's data fabrication, so this is not just a comment of statistics or something, they may even have gone to court and obtained this evidence in discovery. And in the United States, there's no prohibition legally against discussing or using, showing this evidence. Is that still the case? We've had feedback that there was sort of PubPeer was prohibiting that kind of information.
That shouldn't be true. So if information is public, it can be linked from the site, for instance. So blog posts or court cases, you can certainly put up a link to that information. If people want to make personal allegations, that's really on the borderline between hearsay. So if they're prepared to sign their comment, it's something we might consider. If they can provide data or make information public. But we can't accept anonymous comments that are based on what would be hearsay for other readers.
Of course, I meant evidence-based.
So there's not a kind of total inhibition on that anyway. So.
Diron Ran from Academia Sinica, Taipei, Taiwan. I truly appreciate PubPeer disclosed the most serious scientific misconduct in Taiwan history. My question is, how do you conclude that the value of the comments from anonymous peers is equivalent to those from registered peers? How do you do the experiment?
Well, I just read all the comments. Okay,
so
that's my opinion. Well, it's very difficult to. So we don't have any way at the moment of.
But it should be done. It should be able to be done.
Oh well, go ahead. I mean, feel free. But it's not. I mean, I take your point. It's not very easy to measure, and certainly there are examples of registered and unregistered comments that are not great. But I think it's a pretty low percentage of the comments, and there are all those safeguards where people, of course, can respond, can defend their work, can show their data. So. People can defend themselves. So obviously, I mean, I'm aware of the, we were huge in Taiwan a few months ago, and there was a big scandal, and there was, I believe, one series of comments where, in the end, I think they were made in good faith. They turned out probably not to be justified. We don't attempt to make any definitive judgment on that. We just let things play out, and the authors defended themselves very effectively anyway. So in that particular case, there was what would appear to have been an anonymous comment that didn't go down well, but it got sorted out, and it was just because tensions were running particularly high at that very time, I believe, that it caused an issue. But
okay. I would just make one comment myself, which is that we had a case where there were doubts expressed about a paper on PubPeer. That encouraged the first author, the principal behind that particular piece of research, to come forward and confess to manipulation and falsification. And that was a result of worrying about the comments of peers on PubPeer. So
it seems it was true in that case. And that's actually, I mean, obviously cheating is never good, but people who are honest and make a clean breast of it are quite rare. So, I mean, there's something to be gained from that. But
one last comment and we move on.
Hello, I'm Chris Graff. I work at a publisher called Wiley, and I volunteer at the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE.
Okay.
My question is, well, it looks like you've solved a lot of problems with PubPeer already. You've done a lot of work, and it's looking very, very good. I'm wondering what your next challenge is, what remains to be solved on PubPeer?
Well, so, I mean, how many people actually knew the site before coming? So that's most of you. I think if you did the poll amongst ordinary researchers, there would be many fewer who would know. I mean, you people see a kind of concentration of the kind of problems that appear on our site. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done still, just getting the site known, encouraging people to comment. So the kind of comments I showed where, you know, clearly there's been some kind of misconduct happening, that's obviously critical to know. It's important to get rid of that kind of problem. But in a way, I was expecting, and I hope that there would be more comments about slightly more scientific issues where people feel that something has been interpreted incorrectly. But, you know, we're completely dependent on what people are motivated enough to comment on. So we'll just have to see how that goes. We do have a few other plans, but I'm not going to say anything particularly precise. We've redone the website, and we're hoping to launch a new version which will just be a little different and a lot more robust, easier for us to maintain. And we're in particular going to change the registration system, so we're going to hold a lot less information about users, in fact. But anyway, you should see that in the coming months, maybe.
Okay, so I think now we have to move on. Thank you very much, Boris, for that. And we can come back.